The 2023 NBA playoffs are finally over, which makes now the perfect time to look at them in retrospect and see what we actually learned from this year's playoffs. So, let's get into it. Real quick before I get into this video, if you end up enjoying it, please be sure to subscribe. There's going to be 3 videos a week on this channel for the foreseeable future. Also drop a like. It only takes 1 second and makes a massive difference in how the video performs in the YouTube algorithm. It is much appreciated. Seriously. 1 second. Anyways, we're going to go series by series here. I think there is a lesson to be learned for pretty much every series of this year's playoffs. So yeah, let's start in the Eastern Conference in round 1. Let's start with Boston versus Atlanta, and this first lesson isn't necessarily all that new, but it kind of was a setup for what we would see from the Celtics for the rest of these playoffs. And that lesson is that the Celtics love to play with their food. So much so that in both of the following rounds, the games went to 7 when they realistically shouldn't have. I can let Atlanta get 1 game on you, but 2 is pretty bad for a team that's supposed to be a contender and a top dog, especially given that it looked like Atlanta would push it to 7 for most of Game 6. The fact that series was that close is just unacceptable. For Miami versus Milwaukee, I think it's quite simple. It's not necessarily something super new, but I think the depth of how important this issue is was exposed here, and that is that the Bucks just have a fundamentally awkward offense. And I think that primarily stems from Giannis's limitations as an offensive player. Back even when Milwaukee did win a championship, it came with a ton of awkward offense. Something they can still win with, obviously, because they have, but nevertheless, it seems to be the reason when they do lose. It doesn't help as well that I think Milwaukee has a lot of not amazing three-point shooters who take a high volume of threes. Drew Holiday was a disaster from outside in that series. Brook Lopez was a non-factor from outside. Really, other than like Chris Middleton and like maybe if we're being generous, Pat Connaughton, there's no one on Milwaukee that I'm that super confident in as a three-point shooter, which is not ideal given that a lot of Milwaukee's offense is predicated on their three-point shooting. So yeah, I think we can skip Sixers versus Nets. That's not even a real playoff series. For New York versus Cleveland, we learned that I am an idiot for having believed in the Cavaliers so much. I deadass thought they could go all the way to the conference finals just to win 1 game against the Knicks. But there's another thing. I think we learned that good regular season defenses that are one-dimensional are not good playoff defenses. If you have a weak perimeter defense, it will be exploited. If you have a weak interior defense, it will be exploited. It does not matter if the other side of the spectrum is God tier. The Cavaliers with Allen and Mobley had the paint on lock, but that did not matter because Donovan Mitchell and Darius Garland were getting cooked by Jalen Brunson and so on. And we even saw this with the Utah Jazz in the past with Rudy Gobert. Obviously, the interior defense is good, but if your perimeter defenders cannot perimeter defend, you're gonna give up holes and teams are going to take advantage. That sounded disgusting. Out West, Warriors versus Kings. I think the obvious lesson here is how important experience is. For all intents and purposes, the Sacramento Kings should have been a better basketball team, and they were in the regular season through and through. But the hobbled and lacking in-depth Warriors were able to overcome them because they've been here before. For Lakers versus Grizzlies, we learned that Dylan Brooks sucks. Well, for me, that wasn't new, but for a lot of people, I don't know how much they knew the depth of which he sucks, but also that's not actually the main lesson. I just wanted to be a dick. I guess what we learned is that AD is like officially the best defender in the NBA. Like, he was ridiculous defensively in this series as well as the next one, and for me, this display put him at number 1 in the league in terms of defense. For Minnesota versus Denver, again, this was a weird one, but there is some lesson here. It appears that Anthony Edwards can fucking play in the playoffs. He was fantastic for Minnesota and an otherwise letdown of a series. Really, we've only seen 2 star-level players perform at or above their level versus Denver in the playoffs. In the case of like Cat for Minnesota, he struggled. Kevin Durant struggled versus Denver. LeBron struggled versus Denver. Even AD did a little bit. Jimmy Butler obviously did. I guess Bam Adebayo was better, but for the most part, the star to superstar level guys that they matched up with played worse. But in the case of Ant and Devin Booker, both of them played phenomenal. And I feel like there's been a lot of conversation around how good Devin Booker was, but not so much for Anthony Edwards. For Clippers versus Suns, we learned that Russ is still capable of putting up very impressive stat lines and playing as the player that we knew him to be a few years ago. But the downside of that is that we also just had it confirmed that if you're going into the playoffs with Russell Westbrook as your best player, you're more likely than not destined to flame out early in the NBA playoffs. But credit to him, Russell Westbrook had arguably a top 5 individual playoff series for his entire career in this year's playoffs, so that was very cool to see. Over in round 2 in the Eastern Conference for the Sixers and Celtics series, man, this thing felt like a mid-off. You guys know that episode of South Park where they're all playing baseball and both teams are trying their hardest to lose? That's what it felt like watching this entire series. But the main takeaway for many was, wow, Joel Embiid seriously doesn't have like a single great playoff series. Hell, does he even have that many good ones? In fact, he usually plays worse than his regular season level far more often than he ever plays better or even on a similar level in the playoffs. And I think seeing him do this once again, I realize injury was part of the factor here, but either way, seeing him do this once again made a lot of people realize, damn, this guy is almost 30 and we haven't seen him outside of the second round. And really, we haven't seen him in very many competitive series outside of the second round. So like the most impressive opponent that Joel Embiid has beaten in the NBA playoffs in his career was a 48-win Toronto Raptors team post Kawhi. Not great. He only has so much time left, given that he is almost 30, to establish himself as not a postseason loser, because otherwise that is the trajectory his career is going towards. I don't have anything for Heat versus Knicks. Like, Julius Randle sucked, but him sucking in the playoffs isn't a new lesson. We knew he'd do that. So moving on. For Denver versus Phoenix, I think this series was a perfect example of how star power is not enough to win a series for you. You need a lot more than that. The Suns were essentially Devin Booker and Kevin Durant taking turns being great one-on-one scorers while they got nothing from everyone else. Meanwhile, Denver, with just one superstar rather than 2, beat them fairly easily, all things considered. Names are cool. Good team basketball is cooler, at least in terms of, winning. For Lakers Warriors, I think we learned just how much Golden State was lacking in terms of bench production by comparison to what they had last year. There were a lot of reasons to be down on the Warriors going into this one, but I was truly shocked by just how little they got from basically everybody that wasn't Steph, a little bit of Draymond, occasionally Klay Thompson, and occasionally Wiggins. Jordan Poole was a non-factor. Gary Payton II wasn't nearly as effective as he was last year. I mean, JaMychal Green hit a 3 here or there, but really just nothing for them. If Steph was not completely on fire, which he was not in this series versus LA, the Warriors just had no hope of scoring enough points. Conference Finals time. Now, starting with Heat versus Celtics, I think the main takeaway, although there is plenty to talk about, is that Jaylen Brown is not nearly as good as a lot of people said he was. As someone who has been not as big of a fan of Jaylen Brown in the past few years, even I was surprised by how bad he performed in this Miami Heat series. Frankly, I don't think it's fair to go all the way into the he sucks territory, but I do think Miami did a great job of exposing the issues that Jaylen has and proving why it's absolutely ridiculous to say that he's better than Jason. He's just fucking not. Where you would expect Jaylen to really step up in this series is in Game 7 after Tatum hurt his ankle. You would look to him to be the one to close this out, or if he can't accomplish that, which is understandable, at the very least have a big game. But instead, he had 8 turnovers, 5 fouls, and scored 19 points on 23 shots. Yikes. For Denver versus LA, I think we learned that Jokic and the Nuggets offense is truly, truly unstoppable. Now, we saw them look unstoppable versus Minnesota. We saw them look unstoppable versus Phoenix, but those were 2 defenses that you didn't expect to be particularly impressive. Like, obviously, the Timberwolves had Rudy Gobert, but they didn't have Jaden McDaniels, who was arguably just as important to their defense at that point. And yeah, not to mention Jokic has a history of absolutely bitching Rudy Gobert. So a lot of people going into this series said LA is the real test for Denver, because LA's defense to that point was easily the best defense we had seen in this year's postseason, and then the Nuggets swept them rather easily. And they had no issue scoring the ball. A lot of people said, wow, Jokic looks unstoppable now, like against DeAndre Ayton, but wait till he sees AD. And then he averaged 28, 15, and 12 on AD. So didn't seem like he had much issue. Now, as for the NBA Finals, I actually have 2 lessons here, and they're pretty connected, actually. 1, the way Miami got here was through finding ways to exploit the weaknesses in their opponent's offense. Milwaukee and Boston both had their very awkward and stagnant offensive moments, and whenever those happened, Miami only made it worse for them. And for New York, that was a ISO-heavy offense that featured Julius Randle, so not hard to exploit. Meanwhile, what Denver was doing, there was just no answer for it, and it's not even the fault of the Heat. But given that Miami's defense and facing awkward, stagnant offenses was how they got this far, well, they just couldn't do it versus Denver. That leads us to our second point, which is Miami's offense, especially when Jimmy Butler is not doing exceedingly exceptional things, it's just not enough shot creation. There is not enough star power or just scoring gravity in general with the Miami Heat outside of Jimmy Butler and sometimes Bam Adebayo. Sure, Caleb Martin or Gabe Vincent or Kyle Lowry can create a shot here or there, but not reliably and not in a way that really scares the defense. So much so that it seemed like the Nuggets decided, hey, if we die by Caleb Martin, then we die by Caleb Martin, and it didn't happen. This series became simply Denver isn't bothered by Miami's defense, and because of that, Miami has no damn shot because they don't have enough offense to match. So yeah, that's my thoughts on the 2023 playoffs. 1 lesson from each series, 2 for the final. Shout out to Rudy for editing this video, and goodbye.